you're right. Cities have an enormous amount of things to solve, and particularly a South African city, but actually any city anywhere in the world has lots of problems to solve. But I think what makes brand particularly interesting is that it makes it easier for problems not to be at the foreground for some cities. So if you think about London, you're not going to be thinking about rubbish collection, maybe in the way that you might think about it in Johannesburg or Cape Town, but it's got the same problem. So why is it that a city like London can somehow not get in the news for bin collection, whereas Cape Town and Johannesburg will? And I think what we need to realize is every time a city is spoken about, that's an opportunity to convey a message about what that place is about. Maybe another example about bins closer to where I live now in the UK is I did some work with Glasgow ahead of COP26, trying to establish legacy around one of the world's most important conferences on climate change. And their bins was what got most of the media attention. It was incredibly difficult to get the city to shift from talking about bins to actually how we're going to live long-term sustainably in a sustainable way. And that some of that comes down to brand and a city's ability to project itself as more than what people might see in a particular moment in time. So that might seem like something which is, quite flimsy if you have, let's say, issues around equality, you have issues around housing shortages, or actually issues around investment, which, to be fair, these are problems that all cities in the world face, to some way or another. But it seems that when brand works well for a city, it creates an opportunity for the city to deal with challenges in a much more progressive way and in a way that doesn't overcome everything that the city's trying to do from a narrative point of view.
Peter, is there any science or data to show or to prove that brand really matters for cities?
Yeah, I think, Dan, it is always good to have some kind of evidence or proof for saying that brand matters. And I think I'd like to bring up a study that I did a few years ago looking at the impact of digital mentions on cities as brand. And by digital mentions, I mean the number of social media mentions a city gets, the number of mentions it gets on online news and forums. And this was a global study, so it did it across a basket of languages, making up roughly 90% of global mentions on cities. Did it at a global scale, really wanted to get a sense of, what is a place's global footprint, and made sure that things like geography, so we didn't want all the mentions to be concentrated in one place, but also language. So, for example, let's say all of the mentions are in New York and they're all English. Well, actually, that wouldn't be a global footprint. So, let's make sure that we're getting a global footprint of mentions. And we found something really interesting is that when we rank the top 250 cities around the world by the number of mentions, and we rank the top 250 cities around the world by GDP, the lists were almost the same. And so we've got a very clear correlation between the two. And yes, there is a little bit of a chicken and egg situation as to what is the direction of travel here. And I can talk a little bit about that in a moment. But I think at a very basic sense, if people aren't talking about a place, and it doesn't really matter whether it's good or bad, if they're not talking about your place, you're not going to attract as much investment as a place where people are talking more about it. So that's particularly interesting. I would give some caveats here. So one is people will always say, or a lot of the feedback I've gotten is, but what about when there's a tragedy in a city and people are just talking about the tragedy? I think what's really helpful about looking at this data at a global scale is almost every city around the world will have a kind of a tragedy spike every 12 to 18 months. It's very normal for that to happen within a city context. And it's not to say you want these things to happen to cities, but that there's a pattern where, almost every city around the world will interact with that. What matters here is if the city is important enough, there will be a continued conversation around the city. If the city is not seen as important, the conversation will drop off very quickly. And so it's not necessarily the spike that matters so much as the fact that if it's sustained, it tells you that people see that place as important, and that becomes a proxy for relevance. So in some ways, people talking about your city, they're going to talk about it if it's seen as relevant. They're not if they won't. That's a really important part for brand. I would say the other side is, well, does this lead to long-term change? I did some work in Helsinki about 4 years ago now, where actually something really interesting happened is that they did a year-long campaign around launching 2 new iconic architectural and cultural sites in the city. They also had the Trump-Putin summit. And when tracking their kind of digital visibility, so the number of mentions they got over a number of years, it went up drastically in this year, and then dropped down again back to normal levels. But what happened after that is that its global city rankings actually went up and sustained some of that level. And so you can very clearly see that the city benefited from at least a short-term boost in people's perceptions of it as a city that you should do business, or you should travel to, or you should invest in, or you should be in just because it's interesting. And so it does seem that in a very tangible sense, if people are talking about place and there are campaigns designed to achieve that, a city will have at least a short-term benefit from that.